Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention. Welcome to this afternoon's session. My name is Maurice Dupel, and I'm a city councillor for the city of Cornwall, and it gives me great pride to welcome everybody here to the conference. So thank you very much. And I have the privilege to introduce our next speaker and presenter. Marc Thompson Brandt is a senior conservation architect and urbanist of MTBA and Associates in Ottawa. For over 30 years, he has worked in the natural and cultural conservation for the architecture and planning environments, specializing in adaptive reuse and context-sensitive design. MTBA has successfully completed hundreds of assignments, including built preservation and rehabilitation projects, investigations, sustainability and heritage assessments, impact statements, feasibility studies, and heritage-sensitive urban infill for public and private clients. Marc is involved in many community and industry-related committees where he shares knowledge and experience in more broad and tangible ways. MTBA is the principal author of the forthcoming illustrated Guidelines for Sustainable Rehabilitation of Buildings in Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Mr. Marc Thompson Brandt.
Just going to get wired up here. Well, greetings. I hope you all had a fabulous lunch and that you took in some caffeine so you don't fall asleep. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to the conference committee for inviting me to share a few things that I keep near and dear in the world of heritage conservation, and share a couple of ideas of where I think heritage is going. And I just would like to indicate that when I was first asked by the conference committee to come and do this, I said, well, okay, but what exactly do I do? I said, well, just talk about your work, talk about adaptive reuse. We want someone to talk about adaptive reuse. And I said, okay, well, I've been adaptively reused many times, so I'm probably an expert at that, and I can get away with that. But what's the target audience? I said, well, it's a typical Ontario Heritage Conference. And I said, oh, okay, so from A to Z, from community people to professionals. Yeah, okay, no problem. I love speaking to broad audiences. It always makes it a little harder. So what I did, the first thing I did was I sat down and I said, well, I'm gonna start with a title, and I'm gonna work out from there. So the title really does, I think, speak to what I want to get across today in a very broad way. Yes, it is a double entendre. It is heritage lives and heritage, building lives and building lives. Building lives in the sense that buildings do live. And hopefully you'll pick up on that as we move through some of the talk as we go. They live, they're organic, they grow, they change, just like we do as people, just like we do as communities. Pardon me. And then for building lives, I felt that it was important to describe some of the lives of buildings that we've been involved with and look at those changes in those lives over time. So I'm just going to learn how to do this here. I've divided it into three parts. One is sort of more of I thought it was worthy to review some fundamentals about adaptive reuse. Many of you might think that your eyes might glaze over a little bit, but it's perhaps a return to some fundamentals that I think is worthy to build the discussion on. The second part is something that I hope many of you are getting more and more interested, and that is the marriage of natural and cultural conservation. And thirdly, there's those lives that I was talking about. I want to talk about, I just chose 7 because I like the number 7. 7 projects that we've been working on and adventures that we've been having. So the first part really has sort of 4 sub-themes. And I want to talk about heritage conservation in the context of all existing buildings. So speaking of fundamentals then, adaptive reuse is simply adapting an existing older building from its original intended use to a new use. And the new use is simply one that's more suitable for this time and this place. It's really just buildings, as I said earlier, organically evolving. They're built to last buildings. So they tend to evolve at different rates than we as people do or as our communities do in many cases. So we'll see some examples here of the different applications of that. Although we think in terms of heritage buildings, in fact, adaptive reuse occurs with any older building, and they may have happened to outlive their usefulness at that time and place or outgrown their natural life cycles for some of their materials and assemblies. There's very many understanding, planning, and implementing actions, to quote the standards and guidelines, which we'll talk a bit more in a minute, that will need to take place for an adaptive reuse. Every project has all of its complexities. But in our view, it takes two main factors to make it happen in the first place, to make adaptive reuse desirable and feasible. The existing building must possess some base value. It could be that the average person will look at the building and go, oh, that's a pretty ugly piece of industrial garbage. But in fact, if you peel away some layers, you'll find that there is some big heavy-duty base value associated with the building. So there's lots of ways that you can provide base value. And the second is that the new use must be compellingly needed in some way. As I said, for that particular contemporary situation in that place. And that need needs to be compatible in some way with the building. Compatibility, as you'll see with some of the examples, comes in many guises, many forms, and wearing different clothing all the time. But from our perspective in our work, the compatibility has to, as a base minimum, has to be with at least with the bones of the structure, the fundamental foundations, and I mean that in the broad sense, not in the architectural sense of the building. There will be, by its nature, some preservation of existing buildings in adaptive reuse, in rehabilitations, especially of the more degraded parts, regardless of the building's heritage pedigree or lack thereof. And you might say, well, why are you even telling us that? And you'll see why I'm placing some importance on the fact that as a heritage community, we need to look a little broader, and we'll come back to that in a minute too. So as part of today's presentation, one of the takeaways I want to give you is I want to recommend 3 books that I think everyone in this room should read if you haven't already. It's not homework, you don't have to, but if you choose, I'd like to be able to introduce them to you. In his 1994 book, How Buildings Learn, author Stuart Brandt brilliantly engages us with his multi-pronged proposal that buildings adapt best when they're constantly refined and reshaped for their occupants, or others, I would add, over time. He advises that more than any other human artifacts, buildings actually improve with time. I guess that's like a fine wine. But he says, if they are allowed to. And therein lies the rub. There are right and wrong ways of doing it. And Brandt talks about adaptive reuse both existentially and very practically in this book. It's an amazing book. And he shows us how to work with time. How to work with time with respect to your building or building project, not against time. He insists that heritage conservation needs adaptive reuse to stay relevant. And I think if you went to a lot of the sessions just here at this conference, you would probably agree with that. In this quote, he says, preservation, and of course he's American, so he calls it preservation. We all know as Canadians, we know the proper word is conservation, don't we? So he says, preservation's best political, economic design device is adaptive reuse. And by that quote, I interpret it to mean that an adaptive reuse can actually trigger the heritage conservation treatments that would otherwise not be economically feasible. So in the example on the screen, in a project that we're doing, these high-value pieces of art, they're Queenston limestone bas-relief panels by a famous sculptor from New York. They wouldn't get the proper conservation treatments and cleanings that they would not get these treatments unless there was an opportunity for an adaptive reuse of the building. And I guess the second point is that adaptive reuse is part of really a strategy, isn't it? It allows contemporary uses into old and run-down buildings and neighborhoods, and that really is a surefire political and urban renewal strategy. And I was on the cotton mills tour today, and that's a great example there. But heritage conservation has a lot of power, and I'm not 100% convinced that we as a heritage community grasp the essence of that. And the power when conservation is part of an adaptive reuse is it adds the value of the old to the value of the new. But the result is so much more than just the sum of the two parts. And I think that I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about that power. I should tell you a bit about this illustration as well. This is one that we were involved with recently. It's in New Edinburgh, a heritage conservation district in Ottawa. And the photograph at the bottom is a very sad-looking little bungalow in the midst of all of these beautiful Victorian and post-Victorian two-story buildings. And the reason it's a bungalow is that the original design in the 1940s was more like what you see above, in the drawing above. They designed it to be a two-story, two-unit, two flats for some post-war housing. But they got the first story done, and they ran out of money. So they simply slapped a roof on it, and a pathetic little roof, I would say. Not very opinionated generally, but those who know me know I'm fibbing there. I'm very opinionated. But a pathetic little roof that really, the building really does not suit the neighborhood. So the new owner, when he purchased it, he got together with the family, the widow, who was now living right across the river out the back of the property in an old age home that in a high rise that overlooked the property, had a lot of sort of memories and values that she had associated with the thing. And the new owner was sort of taken by that, and he decided to build what the passed away husband, the previous owner, had originally intended to do. But at the same time, he added a third unit at the back. So this is actually a modern design at the third unit at the back, which overlooks the river. And he's a developer of a small company that's very sustainability oriented. So this not only is this giving back to the historic character of the original design, not only is it improving the neighborhood by becoming a better gateway building on this street corner, but he's also giving back to the planet by making it a green design. So when I say much more than the sum of the parts, in fact, there are those who claim that the best buildings are those with a slight misfit between old and new, because it gives them a special edge and drama. And indeed, there are many folks who love eating dinner, for example, in an old fire hall or brokerage, or going to a nightclub by walking through the 1930s vault of an old bank, or checking into their hotel room, which is really a converted grain silo. That one's got a whole lot of edge to it, I would say. And I think that it's a popular thing. We have to be careful in the heritage community not to get heritagey, but to be realistic about what it is that we're doing in the new use. In fact, Heritage Canada even recently featured the growing array of Canadian brewpub adaptive reuses across the nation, and they're really leveraging the essence of heritage architecture to their commercial advantage. And I think that's when we talk about the power of heritage conservation, we really need to think that way. More and more, we need to talk about these things from environmental and economic and social perspectives. And I think there is a hidden power in there that needs to be tapped, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second as well. So, in 1964, an abandoned chocolate factory on the San Francisco waterfront was converted into a shopping complex named after the chocolate company, and it was called Ghirardelli Square. And it was instantly a major tourist attraction. It became the prototype for many adaptive reuse commercial projects all over the world. In fact, in many instances, that model is so commercially attractive you can do it with private investment, which isn't always easy, as many of you will know. But the advantages that the adaptive reuse then, as it does today, brings to the table is that a lot of old buildings are big old warehouses or whatnot, and there's a lot of big adaptable spaces, which is very important for adaptive reuse. These buildings often still, to this day, after tens or hundreds of years, have good bones. They're very often in picturesque settings, for instance, maybe on waterfronts or near other urban amenities. And those picturesque places, and I use that term loosely, picturesque, those places are places of meaning. They're places with stories. And they're buildings, perhaps, with stories as well. And that has value. Being also close to critical masses of population and the fact that these types of projects are popular and politically favorable doesn't hurt. If you think of, I'm just going to go back one here, sorry. If you think of places like Faneuil Hall Market at the Boston's waterfront, or New York's Seaport, South Street Seaport, Vancouver's Granville Island, which is one that we've modeled something on, which you'll see in a minute. Places like Halifax's historic properties, Toronto's Distillery District, the list goes on. The Forks in Winnipeg, et cetera, et cetera. And now possibly in Ottawa, Ottawa-Gatineau, that is, the Chaudière District, and we'll speak about that one a little bit more later too. So Brandt claims, so I'm back to this author of this book, How Buildings Learn. He claims that it was 1964 with the Ghirardelli chocolate factory that was when economic and popular positives really kicked adaptive reuse into high gear. I disagree with him on that. I think that, in fact, adaptive reuse has been going on since humans started to build. Great examples, the Parthenon. Everyone knows the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. It was built as a temple, then it became a working church for centuries, and then a mosque. Pretty serious adaptive reuse. Its cousin in Cordoba, La Mezquita, was a great Islamic mosque. And for centuries, it was regarded as one of the most accomplished monuments of Moorish architecture, yet it was converted into a Roman Catholic Christian cathedral in the 13th century. So, you know, those are very serious elements of adaptive reuse. Notre Dame in Paris, in fact, those of you who know the story a little bit, it was, after a century or two of its life, it was restored so far beyond its original design, they never would have recognized it from the original. Jane Jacobs says that Stuart Brand's book is possibly a work of genius. So I thought I would bring her bring her ghost into the room with us. Now, quoting Jane Jacobs has become something of a very trendy thing. I was really hesitant to bring Jane into this discussion, but because one of her famous quotes is so apropos, I felt I was compelled to do this. Old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings. And probably most of you have heard about that one already. It's a well-known quote. And she, of course, is a beloved thought leader on urbanism. But the context in which Jane wrote that in 1964, there's that year again. What do you think that's just because it was only a few years before the Summer of Love or something? Things were bubbling up. She spoke to how poor young entrepreneurs couldn't afford AAA class office space in shiny new buildings for their offices, for their showrooms, their studios, their incubator labs, their workshops, etc. So they ended up going down market in old buildings. Then when their companies succeeded, their success was often associated and interpreted with their quarters in heritage buildings. And of course, by that time, then they were successful enough that they had enough money to buy them and fix them up and add to them, and so created a positive cycle. And really, this could be seen really as an early model of modern adaptive reuse and rehabilitation. But that was during the post-war period when new is good, old is bad. So that action was very, very creative at the time, going against the tide of cultural mores of the era. Now, really, there's a paradigm shift, isn't there, that's happening, that's throwing that old adage completely on its ear. Adaptive reuse of heritage buildings is now seen as cool, and it's more commonly being practiced by companies like Google. And let me tell you, Google are no longer poor young entrepreneurs. Jane Jacobs, in fact, advocated for urban diversities. I think that was a fundamental first principle of what she was advocating, including a rough mix of building types and ages. And of course, that's where adaptive reuse within an urban context really hits home. I'd suggest today that there's a growing, a real sense of an awareness, a real growing awareness that heritage building rehabilitation and preservation is a strong best practices example for rehabilitation of all existing buildings. That this puts heritage conservation in the enviable position of being part of a larger and more powerful economic demographic, as well as being cast as a leadership entity in global building renewal. So, important point to take home with you, because I'm not sure that we, as a heritage community, are leveraging that enough, and I want to talk a bit about that now. Because those facts suggest the following questions. Are we doing enough to encourage adaptive reuse and rehabilitation? Well, if you went to the Cotton Mills tour today and you listened to the representative from the city of Cornwall looking at all of the incentives that they did bring it together, darn right that they were doing all they could to promote adaptive reuse. But is that happening across Ontario communities far and wide? We need to think about that. Second question, will we embrace the lessons learned from heritage rehabilitation to promote and apply as the best practices for adaptive use of all worthy existing buildings? Because we know that there's a very huge growing market and an abundance of adaptive reuse opportunities coming online in the next decades. If you think about just the plethora of buildings built since the war, you'll see what I mean. And the third question, how will we as a heritage community leverage these huge attributes? And so there's some food for thought that I'd like to leave you with while we go on through the discussion. The graphic simply indicates those two big chunks of potential leverage. It comes back to a quote where we sort of started in this discussion today. In other words, rehabilitation and adaptive reuse can apply to all aging buildings, but in order to preserve high-value heritage buildings in today's economy, you know, where there's greater reliance, for example, on private investment, there's greater emphasis on a short-term bottom line, et cetera, we must find appropriate and feasible ways to reuse them and rehabilitate them. And the illustration is some sketches that we did for the Victoria and Chaudière Islands master plan, which we'll talk about again in a few minutes. So, the challenge is, it often takes great skill to successfully design demanding new programs and interventions into high-value heritage buildings without compromising heritage character elements and heritage value. And I think when we talk about being heritagey, that's something that we need to think about. It's so important to define the character elements. It's so important to define the value before finding ways to accommodate the new program. Both this fact and the fact that aging existing buildings are indeed a major force to be reckoned with within our overall economy in the years to come is going to be continue to be discussed throughout this discussion. I just wanted to throw this up. If you look back here first, there's the demanding program coming in, and what does it do? And there's a universe of solutions, design solutions, and we know about compatibility, distinguishability, and subordinate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the standards and guidelines. But let's first talk about the natures of building, and here's book 2 of the 3. In his 2011 book, The Secret Lives of Buildings, British architect Edward Hollis tells us that the life of any structure is neither fixed nor timeless. Buildings, even good ones, and yes, even iconic ones, either evolve over time, or if not, they're swept away in the tide of life's great pageant. And sorry, don't blame Hollis for that quote, that's me. Says Hollis, for buildings, incremental change has been the paradoxical mechanism of their very preservation. Having been transformed, they have endured in a way that they would never have done if no one had ever altered them. And I think that's an important lesson that we need to carry forward as we fight the good fight for heritage conservation. The building that's illustrated on this slide is in the Chaudière Islands Heritage District, and while it was built essentially as a factory, right, it's a steam plant for Ottawa Electric Railway, one of the province's first electric railways, it's now a climbing gym because the big old boilers that have been removed were created spaces that are suitable for climbing. It's better for adaptive reuse today. Now, they haven't rehabilitated the building. They've basically made it safe for people to go and use it. And, you know, there are going to be those who will debate the heritage value of this particular building. I included it in a series of buildings that I recommended for saving, but even if you decide that it doesn't have heritage value, it has value to community to recycle it. So Hollis, after he mentions the quote from the last slide, he then goes on to recount 13 true stories of examples of that very thing throughout history. And I showed you the slide earlier, the Parthenon, the La Mesquita, and Notre Dame. There are 3 of the 13 examples. And these are all great monuments, and they've been revered over the centuries, but they're not some shacks caught up in the flotsam and jetsam of a bustling city and discarded by uncaring change. So the point is that it applies broadly across, humble buildings to iconic ones. So, and then his conclusion, if you haven't already read it, well, we changed mics here. Architecture is all too often imagined as if buildings do not and should not change, but change they do, and have always done. Buildings are gifts, and because they are, we must pass them on. The illustration is the mezzanine of the Girding Theatre in Portland, which was once the Portland Armoury, and I believe we're going to the Cornwall Armoury for dinner tonight, are we not? So maybe you can try and imagine something like this when you're inside eating dinner tonight. So we'll go from the nature of buildings to the nature of stewardship. And if you don't mind, before we do, I just want to say one thing about the very nature of buildings, of their longevity and stability, is it's their ability to adapt. If you embrace this view that buildings do adapt and that they're not static forever, and it may be a large one to swallow for some. Hollis suggests that architects would be particularly hard-pressed to swallow that. But if you do, you realize that once we have the technical aspects of built heritage conservation mastered, things like the standards and guidelines and the Ontario Heritage Toolkit, then the most important element of conservation is the understanding that the only true way to save a building or monument is to ensure its use continues, or more accurately, some use for it continues, as it will often be repurposed, as we know, throughout the natural changes in life to it. So people have talked to me about this debate. Is it adaptive reuse or adaptive use? And there's been, I've been to other conferences where there's been a huge debate. So my take on it is simply this. If it changes the use, if it's a rehabilitation and changing of the use, it's an adaptive reuse. If it's just a rehabilitation, it's just an adaptive use. For the nature of stewardship, as I mentioned, I'd like to take a little bit of a tangent, go on a little bit of a side story. After the Second World War, rapid and seemingly limitless growth and development occurred in North America, and everywhere, but particularly North America. 50s, 60s, and 70s were times of boundless desire for change, and the built environment was certainly at the epicenter of that change. Massive new populations and technologies brought massive new needs and expectations. Especially in the 1950s, there was an almost militaristic sense of conquering anything and everything, from disease to poverty, transportation to housing, education to outer space. It was man employing science to overrule nature and progress boldly into the future. In this vision, as I alluded to earlier, everything old was bad and everything new was good. So there's the building boom. That's only a few years of differential in Los Angeles. In the architecture and building construction worlds, the simultaneous flowering of international-style modernism in North America was just really, in my view, the surface impact of this attitude. In fact, there were many other factors that were bigger. And one of them is the emergence and ascension of mechanical and electrical engineering. Are there mechanical and electrical engineers in the room? Put your hands up. Okay, good. So I won't get lynched. Oh, there's one. You look very friendly. Oh, you're retired. Okay, I'm good. So the advancement of ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, and the easy availability and cheapness of fuels and energy, those together had a much more powerful impact on how buildings were designed and built. What happened was the master designer, who took into account all matters of technical construction and design aesthetics and occupant comfort, was replaced by these silos of the design architect, handing off the design schematics to the various engineers who then, after calculating what technical requirements were needed to provide, for example, appropriate levels of light or air or heat, which was directed by the engineering brethren at ASHRAE, because it was their rules that set the pace, simply indicated what the M&E plant or the equipment needed was required, including its size, its location, its distribution systems, and then they were attempted to be accommodated within the design. There's a de-emphasis on working with the laws of nature and instead dictating what man wanted for man regardless of nature. In the case where a building was allowed to stick around for a while, it was basically raped and pillaged in order to allow it to serve under the new levels of comfort dictated by ASHRAE. I had a professor in university many years ago who was teaching us architectural lighting, and he was a Brit. He'd come over from England to teach this course, and he was astounded about the light levels required by ASHRAE, because in Europe they didn't get anywhere close to that. Well, yeah, they paid different prices for energy. And we now know the results of that approach have been devastating, and certainly from the perspective of the early days of adaptive reuse, where the early days of modern adaptive reuse, because we did discuss that adaptive reuse has been going on timelessly, where high-value heritage buildings were butchered to make them fit this modern mold. That is, quite simply, ladies and gentlemen, poor stewardship. But for now, let's look at this idea of how good heritage buildings were treated. On the one hand, heritage character was lost due to overzealous pursuit of modern technologies force-stuffed into them. And two examples of that are on the screen now. The Government Conference Centre in Ottawa has this very magical entry sequence off the main street. And then you come down, you sweep down into the Grand Hall. And they decided in their wisdom in the 70s and 80s, when they were adapting it from Union Station to a government conference center, that this would be the place that they would throw the translation booths, completely altering the procession into the building and completely hiding sort of the main entry and the sort of power and drama of the original architecture. The other example is a photograph from just about a month ago of a project that we're working on in the Kingston Psychiatric Hospital. It's a fabulous cultural landscape with a number of high-value heritage buildings. And in one of them, a gorgeous 1896 building called Beech Grove, even though the building is empty, They've decided that this is the time where they're going to redo the heating and cooling systems, take advantage of its emptiness. That's okay. But because it's empty, they're not thinking. They're just going in and they're throwing this kind of stuff anywhere and everywhere, including high-value heritage spaces. So the two things, butchering them to fit this modern mold, force stuffed onto them, but also on the other hand, heritage character was lost over the years due to the indifference and lost understanding of simply how to care for them. A masonry wall, for example, was now a maintenance-free wall, which meant careful joint monitoring and life cycle repointing was just not done because, hey, it's maintenance-free. And until it was too late and the wall was in serious destabilization or failure. And so we come back to this question of stewardship. The responsibility to protect otherwise sound buildings from unnecessary degradation or the failure to preserve character-defining elements through adequate understanding of the building and how it lives, how it breathes, how it functions, far more than any well-designed contemporary adaptive reuse intervention. Poor stewardship can be the real cause of losing our heritage and increasing our landfills. The last section of this part, I want to talk about adaptive reuse and its relationship with rehabilitation. So we know that good adaptive reuse of a heritage building also includes good stewardship program of maintenance and repairs, and when both are done well together, they keep our heritage buildings vital, useful, and functional. Guidelines, which are like our maps to help owners and operators, architects and designers make good decisions, they're helping, and we're getting more. In the last decade, we've had more of these new maps, what I'm calling maps, than in the previous 5 decades. Things like the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada by Parks Canada at the federal level, and things like the Ontario Heritage Toolkit on the provincial level. Of course, let's look at some of this stuff. The standards and guidelines tells us there's 3 kinds of conservation treatments. I think this is probably old hat for many of you. Preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation. Restoration is actually the most interventional. And often projects that we are working on, certainly today, are a combination of rehabilitation and preservation. Often, these are adaptive reuse projects. In fact, rehab and adaptive reuse are essentially directly linked. You do one to achieve the other. So let's look at how the standards and guidelines define rehabilitation. Let's just take the wording right out of their mouths. It's defined as the sensitive adaptation of an historic place or a component for a continuing or compatible contemporary use, including enhancing its environmental sustainability, and we'll come back to that, while protecting its cultural heritage values. So essentially, our Bible in Canada tells us that rehabilitation is not just repair, that rehabilitation is adaptation. That's part of the game plan. And the other standards and guideline example, first I just want to just re-emphasize that point. The equation is rehabilitation equals repairs plus new interventions plus sometimes changing the use. The other example from the standards and guidelines is one that I think, it's the standard that I think is the most contentious, the most challenging, the one that will probably end up at the Ontario Municipal Board the most. And it revolves mostly around rehabilitations and adaptive reuses. In fact, it's Standard 11, which is the one in the S&Gs that is specifically for rehabilitation projects. And I've just boiled it down to its essence, and that any new work associated with a heritage building shall be compatible, subordinate, and distinguishable. If the entire world was on the exact same wavelength as to the definition of these words, there would be no problems. But we're not. And that is where you need some high levels of design skill to bring your adaptive reuse into the realm, A, of reality, and B, in terms of making good architecture. There's many interpretations of these rules, we'll call them rules, and their application will differ for each and every project. Nevertheless, the skilled practitioner will know instinctively if the design of the new interventions meets these criteria. Our partners on the Sir John A. Macdonald building, NOR, did this project, which I think is a very good one, probably the best one that they've done on a heritage building. And there you see in the bottom illustration the original 19th century courthouse, and flanking it on the right is a 1960s edition, and flanking it on the left is a 2007 edition. The two upper photos are simply interior details that I wanted to show different aspects, if you will, of compatibility, distinctiveness, and subordination. So it's not my intent to show you something that I think is a lock for meeting the standards and guidelines. It's my intent to say, here's a good example to debate. And here's another good example to debate. The same firm together with our firm. In this case, we have a new addition beside what Bruce Kuwabera calls a temple. And he says, how do you add to a temple? It's not easy. It has to be distinct and of its own age. So there you see in the upper photo, in the middle foreground, the modern edition. The modern edition uses many, many, many clues and cues from the original temple and materials, inherent geometries, but it does its thing in a modern way. And I think significantly, as George Baird once, and I'm going to, because it was so humorous when George Baird did it, I'm going to copy the physicality of it as well. He says that the new edition does this to the original temple, a little vaudeville two-step. And, you can't get more compatible than that, can you? On the interior, this thing is wired. This thing has every manner of acoustic, security, lighting, multimedia, broadcast, and I could go on. There's 32 different sub-consultants and specialists on the project to give you an idea of the nature of the interventions. And yet the old banking hall is essentially kept in a way that is appreciated as an old banking hall, even though the new use is for celebrational and ceremonial events. So, how are we doing? We started at about 1:45, and we're about halfway through, so that's perfect. The second part, I want to talk about what I call the nexus of natural and cultural conservation. There's two parts. The first part, I've dubbed it More Value, Inherent Sustainabilities of the Energy Hogs. So, good adaptive reuse of a heritage building also includes, I'm sorry, I've just blown away to the previous page. The respondents of a recent survey conducted in Vancouver, BC, overwhelmingly support the preservation of heritage buildings. Wow, really? they're forward-thinking in Lotus Land. No, seriously. And in the survey, it reports that they contribute to citizens' sense of place, the special meaning or character that a geographic location has that gives a community its unique identity, and hence social cohesion. And the same survey found that 50% of the respondents would prefer living in a retrofitted heritage building compared to 11% preferring a new building. Now, what the heck happened to the other 39%? I don't know, but it's got something to do with Lotus Land, I'm sure. We talked about this attitude from the post-war years of old is bad and new is good. So this survey proves to us that there's a major cultural shift since then. The other thing that we know is that heritage buildings add value to communities through local job creation, cultural and heritage tourism, and stronger social connections. So these are the things that we already know, that how heritage adds value. What about more value? Because heritage adds value in a lot more ways. It adds value, for instance, in the very important environmental sustainability mode. Both heritage conservation and environmental preservation are essentially about the same thing, preserving what we value. They're both elements of sustainable stewardship. They're both concerned with fostering development that's environmentally as well as socio-culturally and economically sustainable in the very long term. I wanted to pick those from the local area. Will recognize the Cornwall Public Library and Hoople Island at Long Sault. Has anyone not heard of the 3 pillars of sustainable development? Just put your hands up. Oh, fabulous. So the vast majority. Okay. So I'm going to go through this fast. I used to say, no, there's 4 pillars. You can't just say social, environmental, and economic. What about the cultural? What about the cultural? And I've realized in the ensuing time that really it's sociocultural. They're combined because they're about the people. So when it's the 3 Ps, people, planet, and profit, they relate to sociocultural, environmental, and economic. In business, people call it the triple bottom line, and I think it's incredibly important that we understand, that we in the heritage community understand our work from this perspective. Over the last decade, we've gathered enough empirical evidence to confidently state that the buildings once considered energy hogs are actually providing some fairly high levels of sustainability. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with words. There's way too many words on this slide. But I wanted to get the point across from very important sources. Donovan Ripa. Anyone who's not heard of Donovan? Okay, great. Wow, this is great. I'm preaching to the converted here. You may have heard this quote then, and I'm not going to read it, but essentially I've organized it in a way with the brackets to show you how it works with the 3 pillars. And the National Trust for Historic Preservation has this great sub-organization, I guess I'll call it, called the Preservation Green Lab. Has anyone not heard of the Preservation Green Lab? Wow, we're doing very well. This is a great group. Okay. The greenest building, quantifying the environmental value of building reuse, is really a landmark document because it gives us a scientific and business basis for the sustainability of heritage buildings. And I think this quote basically takes it down to the nut. But there's more than this than meets the eye. While it's now common knowledge that buildings are the largest single source of energy used and waste and emissions into the atmosphere, for example, nearly half the greenhouse gases we produce in North America comes from buildings. But this synchronicity between heritage and sustainability gets a lot better. Although there are many heritage buildings with low-performing envelopes, as we all know, and hence not scoring well on saving energy in this particular matter, heritage buildings are often otherwise very inherently sustainable. Their inherent sustainability includes factors such as embodied energy, embodied carbon that they represent, and often to the sustainability of traditional building techniques, and things like durable and local materials, repairable assemblies, and long-term life planning. So this then turns around and helps their overall green rating. When it comes time to rehabilitate or adaptively reuse them, we're now learning best practices for doing so in a way that makes them even more sustainable in ways that do not adversely affect their heritage character and value. And a little bit more on this, but I want to set it up because it's very easy to take an existing building and increase its sustainability. It's a different kettle of fish to do that and protect its heritage character elements and protect its heritage value. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a scientific intergovernmental body. It was first established in 1988, endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly. They do, every few years, they put out an assessment report. And here's what they had to say in a recent one. Over the whole, so this is a global perspective here. Over the whole building stock, the largest portion of carbon savings is in retrofitting existing buildings and replacing energy-using equipment due to the slow turnover of the stock. And they claim that they have, from full-scale research around the globe, they have high agreement and much evidence of this. So this isn't just someone getting up at a microphone and making this claim. What about even more value? You see how this is set up. None of us has to tell each other about some of the fundamental values of heritage. And now we're saying, okay, but also sustainable. But also beyond sustainable, what else? And to introduce this concept, I want to give you an example of that armory that I showed you the interior photo a few minutes ago. There's an exterior photo. So it's a sustainable adaptive reuse. It's actually like 8 years old now. It had a unique public-private partnership, which I won't go into the details, but I think creative solutions are the way that we have to go. And this is not a small project. There's 800 seats in 2 different rooms. It's the first building on the National Register of Historic Places, so that's the American equivalent of a Part 4 designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. It's the first one that achieved LEED Platinum, and its awards include America's Greenest Buildings by Forbes.com. Why is that significant? Well, if you look at the green building community, they're all about gadgets and technology and new construction and sexy buildings on magazine covers that are really slick and very cool, which is all very good. But the fact of the matter is we have far more existing buildings. And the fact of the matter is it's existing buildings where if we're going to fight this carbon dragon, it's going to be through existing buildings. So this one is a certifiable heritage monument that's achieving LEED Platinum status. That's a significant thing. Now, that happened 8 years ago. We got some catching up to do here. And catching up we are doing. I'm just going to let you read that for a minute. So the Preservation Green Lab, there they are again. They've just came out last week, a new research on, which is sort of the first phase of a sort of broad tableau of research projects that they're doing, focusing on older buildings and sustainable development. And that's what they're saying. They're basically saying it's not just old heritage buildings, it's the whole manner in which they developed over the last 2 centuries that is actually contributing to improving of communities. And so I think back to that adaptive reuse, the LEED Platinum adaptive reuse of the old Armoury into the Girding Theatre in Portland, and I realized, well, yeah, it's part of the Brewery Blocks, which is a heritage area within an eco-district called the Pearl Eco-District. That entire eco-district is made up of a diversity of buildings. There's Jane Jacobs again, a diversity of ages and types, sizes, but they're all contributing to the environment by reducing their carbon footprints and various other sustainability measures. And leading the way are the heritage buildings within the district. And I think that's significant. Book 3 of 3. Has anyone not read this book? Okay, finally, I tripped you up. I got more than 50%. All right. Maybe we're starting to get into, maybe that was just the fundamentals that we started with. So my colleague Jean Caroon, in her 2011 book, Sustainable Preservation, Greening Existing Buildings, provided further evidence that heritage buildings also add to communities through, yes, the job creation and the cultural and heritage tourism and the stronger social connections, but also through environmental sustainability and a whole host of other measures that are taken. It's an interesting book. Each of the 3 books that I'm recommending to you are very, very different books. This one is the one that reads most like a textbook, but it's got an amazing amount of just full-on examples. There's a lot of examples, but it's a fundamental. This is a Bible, I think, that the heritage community needs to have under its belt. Okay, our final part. We're getting into the adventures now. So we have about 20 minutes, but we'd like to have some time for discussion and questions. So I'll move through them fairly quickly. Now, I understand that one of the sessions talked about this particular building today. Is Alan McDonnell, are you? Oh, there you are. Great. So I understand, Alan, that you talked a little bit about this in a session today or yesterday? For about 12 minutes. Okay, well, we're going to get about 3 minutes more, so you'll get around 15. I want to these 7 adventures that I want to take you on. I want to express them. I want to start by expressing each one as their story of their life. So this started as an ecclesiastic residence in 1808. In 1924, with a major addition. Well, it didn't just happen in the addition in 24, but eventually became a school. And now it's looking for a future use. We worked with Alan and his community group to try and find a new use and find some practical answers. They got involved with the ACO Preservation Works program, and they got hold of some money to hire a consultant, that was MTBA, to do a fairly thorough study at looking at opportunities and options. And it sits, if you look at the upper right image, it sits within a absolutely stunning cultural landscape. I call it an ecclesiastic landscape. It's a pastoral setting. It's on the King's Highway, which is the highland. A small pun there, the Highlands, because it's the Scots who settled it. The high ground from the St. Lawrence Valley to the Ottawa Valley. It's right on that road. Of course, most of you will know about the church ruins there. It's a National Historic Site. It's right across the street. So that upper right photo, I'm standing with my back to the left photo, which is the actual bishop's house, and looking out towards the church, down the lane, and into this cultural landscape that is absolutely extraordinary. The bottom right is simply a detail of what we know is close to about the second iteration of the house, probably in the mid-19th century. The challenge is, it's in a very isolated rural area. And what do you do? And it's a fairly large building, and it's got all this going for it. And we talked about the fundamentals. Yes, the building has value. Yes, it has good bones. All that whole checklist that we talked about a few minutes ago, check, 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 check. But that doesn't automatically mean, okay, here's the new use for it. So I encourage you to talk to Alan afterwards and find out how that community is dealing with that. That's adaptive reuse to come. Second adventure, which was also a study. I wanted to give you a full range of different types, so the first 2 are studies. In this case, another National Historic Site, this time an entire cultural landscape is the National Historic Site. It's a central experimental farm in Ottawa, and they have a great inventory of historic buildings as part of the cultural landscape, and they're basically moving out of them. They've basically moved everything from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada essentially into modern offices on the periphery of the farm. So what are they going to do with they know they've got value. Julian Smith did a study on the entire cultural landscape. They know they've got value, and they understand that they have to maintain these buildings, but they can't maintain them. They can't just throw money at them without giving them new uses. So they asked us to look at, what if we were to do something else with this? And we looked at 3 options, and the preferred option was an executive conference center. So if you look at the image on the left, the photograph is the house, and then the piece of the plan closest to that photograph is, I do have one of these, don't I? So that's the original house there with its wraparound porch. This is a small link structure, and then a much larger structure, but using the same architectural language of things like wraparound porches and materials and things like that, to give it enough of a program to make it a viable executive conference center. And although the money hasn't started to flow for this yet, that they have decided that that's the direction that they want to take. The third one we've hinted at a little bit already, and I think you've probably seen these images already. I just want to tell you a little bit about the original building, though, because this one really is an adventure. So in 1929, the Bank of Montreal was the Bank of Canada. They were the bank that served the Bank of Canada, that served the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada used the Bank of Montreal, just like you and I might use the Bank of Montreal. The Bank of Canada wasn't established until 1937. So the Bank of Montreal wanted to establish a very clear, dominant presence within Ottawa, and they did so with, they tore down their 1870s building across the street from Parliament Hill on Wellington Street, and because at that time, Spark Street, the next street over, was becoming, the Bankers Row that had been on Wellington was now moving to Spark Street at the time. So they took over both the frontage on Wellington and Sparks to say, okay, we're gonna anchor both streets, so nobody can kind of pull a fast one on us. And it's directly across from the Parliament buildings, and it's our Ottawa head office. And it included an area for government officials to come in and actually do the banking of the government. So it was an important building of its day. So they held a national competition. It wasn't an international competition because they had just recently done some major renovation work about a decade or two earlier in Montreal from their original 19th century bank on Place des Armes, and there was a huge brouhaha that they didn't use enough Canadian content. So they were sure to use Canadian content by making it open to Canadian architects only. But of course they had an American architect from Washington who was the competition overseer. Nevertheless, the winner was Barrett and Blackadder. Ernest Barrett was working at the exact same time on a fabulous, my favorite example of Canadian Art Deco, the Aldred Building, also on Place des Armes, right across kitty corner from Notre Dame. If any of you know Montreal at all, you'll probably know that building. At the exact same time that he was designing and building that building for a private sector developer, he was, for a very different client, the very staid and conservative Bank of Montreal, designing this. After they won the competition in 1929, came Black Friday, and the Great Depression started. And the bank made a commitment to see this through and to show solidity and to show stabilization within the country. And that they did. And they went forward and they created some very sort of rock-solid looking temple of a bank with an amazing, amazing banking hall. Today, this is where we're at. Just on the lower left, you're seeing the view from the top of the original building looking north towards the Peace Tower and the rest of the parliamentary precinct. The white shrouded scaffolding in the foreground is the West Block project, which is a massive project going on across the street. And in fact, our project is related to that because the bank will become what's known as the Confederation Room that's currently in the West Block but is moving out as part of the West Block renovations. On the right, we just a couple of weeks ago took down half of the scaffolding that was filling up the Great Hall. So you're now seeing the very early results of the cleaning and various conservation treatments on the plaster ceiling with gold leaf finishes and the Benedict stone, early precast, that looks surprisingly like limestone of the interior and the giant bronze windows. Up above is a recent shot showing the development of the addition. And as I said earlier, there are some adaptive reuse projects that have extremely high value heritage buildings that you have to adapt. And you always hope that the new use is extremely compatible so that you don't have to make fundamental changes. But in the occasions that you do, like 10 times the occupancy from 60 to 600, and taking a stone box that has the reverb so bad that if you stood 5 feet away from the next guy and you were both talking to your tellers, you wouldn't be able to hear each other. That's the reverb time in that hall. Well, guess what? The new use requires a very high level of speech intelligibility. So in one sense, it's compatible because it's a grand hall and they need a grand hall, but in many ways it's not. it sits exposed, for example, and in the post 9/11 world, we have major security concerns. So an adventure it has been for sure. The fourth one, and I understand that there was an accessibility session, I think, at this conference. This one's from the early 90s. In Perth, in 1830, Perth's first lawyer, in fact, a member of the Family Compact, Daniel McMartin, built, if you look at the upper left, built this fine home for his wife. She wanted the brick that she knew from Ohio, so they brought brick from Ohio, came overland on horses and carriages. It's a magnificent mansion, but the town owns it now. In the 1830s, if you look at the upper right, you can see from that angle in the foreground, you can see an addition, an adaptive reuse in a way, from the 1830s, because McMartin's daughter married a doctor, and he gave them the house, and he needed a doctor's office. So the house evolved from a home to a home plus doctor's office, and then in more contemporary times, it became a community center, but it needed to become an accessible community center. So the fourth evolution was the accessibility retrofit, which you see from the 90s, which you see in the bottom two illustrations for the Ontario Heritage Trust. The fifth example is not a building, but a district, and we talked a little bit about it through the talk. It's more than adaptive reuse, but it is an adaptive reuse of a district, but it's really rethinking historic urban landscapes. Good old Heritage Canada, again, decided that it was a national treasure and would be on the cover of one of their recent issues. So it's gone from a meeting place to an industrial district and to possibly a mixed-use eco-district, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So pre-contact times, it was a meeting place. But by 1876, it was the largest sawn lumber industrial site in North America, booming. And now, although this is a fairly pretty little picture, now it's basically an industrial brownfield sitting on Confederation Boulevard. A bit of a dichotomy there. We talked earlier about the Mill Street Brew Pub in Ottawa. This is a same building, an adaptive reuse of an 1842 mill. So when we did the master plan for the NCC, there was a lot of sort of urban design concepts that we brought to the table, adaptive reuse and rehabilitation of the cultural layer that's there. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a sec. But then infilling with new and layering it in and mixing it in, but with lots of public access, because Ottawa really has a real problem with good access to its waterfronts, with the exception of the canal. But even the canal, it's great for access, but not for activities. And when I say activities, I mean beside the canal. As you know, there's some great activities on the canal, from skating to boating. But also, connectivity is really important. Being a pivotal district, it's the sort of cradle of Canadian civilization, is the phrase I like to use. It really means that the three founding nations, Aboriginal, French, and English, this is where they came together. This is the first crossing between Upper and Lower Canada, is the Chaudière Bridge right here. And in terms of the urban context, Ottawa-Gatineau needs to be one city, but there's political and other influences that are keeping it from being that, and that's a problem. It means that we don't have proper interconnectable transportation, for example. And this place could be a part of a healing of that pulling apart. Of course, 30 sites that we recommended for conservation. That would be buildings, structures, and some general sites, including some ruins. And so we looked at it and we said, okay, this was in 1990, and we had zero sustainability in the scope of the project. There was no mandate for any kind of sustainability. So putting that aside for a minute, this is an urban design problem. So these are the principles that we used to develop the urban design concept. And if you look at what they are today in the context, for example, of lead for neighborhood development, you realize this is exactly what we're looking at for green neighborhoods. So we actually did a scoring. We did a very conservative scoring because it was a master plan. This was a few years ago. Two of us in the office became LEED accredited in 2008. So this is about 2009. And we looked at it and we were astounded because even though we reviewed it and scored it extremely conservatively, that without any kind of sustainability in the mandate, the place scored under LEED ND scores gold, was the second highest rating. So we said, imagine what you could do if you were trying. So we actually did that work on our own because the NCC by that point had run out of money for meaningful projects like that on meaningful properties. I'm being facetious. Yeah, I'm a big NCC booster and they do a lot of good work. But they could not get the budget for developing that. And in the meantime, the biggest industry on the site decided finally they were going to move. But the NCC couldn't get the money because Treasury Board turned them down, even though they've been working 20 years on this business plan. So the thing got thrown into the wind, and it got picked up by Windmill Developments. This was the company that secured first right of refusal from Domtar to buy their lands. Now, the Domtar lands makes up about 50% of the district that I showed you, plus there's some additional lands on the Quebec side. And, you know, they're developing a new paradigm with it's not really a public-private partnership. This development on the Domtar lands is really a private development. But where they're going in this new paradigm is they've got, first time ever, that the City of Gatineau, the City of Ottawa, and the National Capital Commission have actually agreed to review for zoning and planning and design together. This is the first time that a developer can say, okay, good, we can answer to one master here instead of three. Because when you're answering to three masters for those very major approvals like that, nothing will ever get done. It just won't happen. So, you know, things are going well. And Windmills retained us to do some consulting. We're part of a larger team. Perkins and Will, head up by Peter Busby, who's now running their San Francisco office. He's a transplanted Canadian. He actually, it's a story I like to talk about. Peter, he commutes to work. He commutes to work from Vancouver to San Francisco. But yeah, so it's a very large team, and we're hoping to create the world's greenest community, which is, you know, you're crazy to go out and say, we're going to create the world's greenest community. I mean, it's just setting yourself up for failure. But these guys are serious, and, you know, good on them for taking it on. They also have said, we want heritage protection, and it is a priority. And they've developed a set of 8 development principles, and heritage is indeed one of the 8. So what I'm hoping is that it'll have a domino effect, and it'll actually force the public sector to get on with their half of the district. Second last one, this is a different type of adaptive reuse. This is about reclaiming identities. So these are landscapes, not buildings per se. And I know that there's been some attention paid to the lost villages here. Anyone who doesn't know about it should by the end of this conference. 2 of the lost villages are Morrisburg and Iroquois. Well, Morrisburg is a half-lost village. Iroquois was a fully lost village, and we're talking about the Seaway project in case anyone's been asleep for the last 2 days. And both communities have retained us on 2 separate projects to look at redeveloping their waterfronts. And this one that you see here is Morrisburg. I just want to show you. That's the original shoreline, the dotted line. And the red is the original lock system, so the Gallop locks that go through. And this is Lock 23. So those are the old locks, the pre-St. Lawrence Seaway days. And the town gathered from there. Well, today, this is the waterfront here, this line here. So all of this part of the town and the locks themselves are submerged. Well, a lot of it was carted away, but what's left that wasn't carted away is submerged. And so what they're left with is this park. essentially, because then they built the rest of the town here. Everyone knows the story, eh? They relocated Highway 2, and they took their downtown Main Street, which looked like that, and they put a plaza on Highway 2. And that was their new Main Street. So it has created what I call scar tissue within the community in terms of memories, in terms of sense of loss. And many people are, well, it's 2 generations later, and they're still feeling the effects. On the good side, there is a lot of good fabric still left in the town of Morrisburg, and there's a lot of people who are great community people and doing great things, and it's actually a fabulous town. So the preliminary designs are starting to look like this. We've got a visitor center, connectivity into the rest of the town. We've got a lookout tower and a number of different features that have come together to form a new waterfront. We just started working on Iroquois. And I was blown away. I was there for the first time a year ago, and I had no idea. This is an unbelievable cultural landscape. To me, it's like a hidden gem. The 3 scenes are like almost typical scenes of the place, and it's just beautiful. But it's quite broken up with different. So of those scenes, upper left is the beach here. Upper right is actually the old canal walk through here, so there's a little marina in here. And associated with the old hydro portion of it is now a series of boathouses that's, it's sort of like Venice on the St. Lawrence in a very sort of low-key vernacular way. It's beautiful, and it's fundamentally finding the adaptive reuse is, like I say, reclaiming identity. And the last adventure is a very different type of adventure, which was mentioned in the introduction. The Federal, Provincial, Territorial Historic Places Collaborative, and if you can say that 3 times fast, I give you a prize. They're the folks that sort of took over from Parks Canada on the 2nd edition of the Standards and Guidelines. They've put out a cultural tourism guidebook for communities across Canada. And they wanted to do another book, and they've retained us. The working title is Illustrated Guidelines for the Sustainable Rehabilitation of Buildings in Canada. And we've crafted it to be sort of a companion volume to the Standards and Guidelines. And it should be out next year. We're just handing in the 95% draft next week, but with all those jurisdictions, there will be many months of approvals before it comes out. So it'll be out next year, and it is illustrated. It's more of a general guidebook with examples, and we have case studies and whatnot as well. We have just a little bit of time for questions and discussion, I believe.
You've been talking about buildings from my perspective, and readapting them, whatever. But when it comes to cultural heritage landscapes, and I have one in particular, it has to do with Bala Falls. And next door, a postal piece of property, they want to build a hydro plant. Now there's a hydro plant one stream over, Mill Stream, that's been there since 1916, and there's 2 further down the road. But it's under the Green Energy Act. If a building, if a power plant was successful to be built there, what sort of guidelines would be appropriate? Would it be the ones that you mentioned earlier about has to be sort of, distinguished the other 2?
Oh, yes.
But how do you protect the cultural heritage landscape, and the property next door has been designated as a heritage property? It was in front of the Conservation Review Board. The Conservation Review Board endorsed it and said, yeah, that's got heritage. David Thompson was there. First Nations were there, and there's a First Nation tree on the property that's going to be redeveloped potentially.
The question involves, in case those of you didn't hear before the gentleman used the mic, the site of Bala Falls in the Muskokas, on the Bala River, in the neighborhood of the village of Bala, and talking about, if I can paraphrase your question, sir, what kind of guidelines would you apply to an adaptive reuse of the cultural landscape through the adding of a hydro facility? Right. And the first thing that comes to mind is that the Standards and Guidelines has a section on cultural landscapes now in the second edition. And while I don't think that there's, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, Jill, anybody in the crowd that uses the guidelines a lot, I don't think under the cultural landscape section there's things quite as sort of straightforward as Standard 11, that new work must be compatible, subordinate, and distinguishable. I think if you applied that standard, however, because if you classified adding a hydro station to a cultural landscape as a rehabilitation of the landscape, and there will be those who will argue against that, but if you did, you're back to that, what I was saying earlier, that if we could all agree as to the definition of those three words, we wouldn't have any problems. And this is a great example of that. So when you say compatible, someone would say, on the hydro side, could say, well, sure, it's compatible. We're letting the water run in and run out. We're not changing it. We're not doing anything. It's compatible. It's green energy. They're going to say, is it subordinate? It's like, well, yeah, we're just one little building in a big, wide cultural landscape. They're going to say, is it distinguishable? Well, darn right it's distinguishable. Right? So, it's not an easy argument. I think because we have Family Place up there, and I know the cultural landscape that you talk about, that I really have mixed feelings on it. And my opinion comes a little bit from the Chaudière Islands project that I showed you, because it was dammed. It was really dammed at the turn of the 20th century with a giant ring dam. So the Ottawa River, it's pretty wide there, right? It's about 100 times wider than the river at Bala. And now that has become part of the cultural landscape, that ring dam. And so it really changes the nature for that one, not Bala, but for that one, it really changes the nature of how you approach it. And the First Nations people, the Algonquins, their vision is to get rid of the dam and free the river. But they're the only, as far as I know, there is a small constituent of environmentally based stakeholders that agree with that viewpoint. But the majority of stakeholders in the general public, they don't really care about that. Now with Bala, it's a different situation. I'm only telling you about this other one because I bring that baggage of that one to my thinking on Bala, as well as the baggage of my family having a cottage in the area. And I think, from my point of view, I think, have all the options been considered? Because that's what you have to do in heritage conservation. If you're going to make an intervention, prove to me that you've looked at as many other options as possibly you can think of, and what were the pros and cons of them, and why is the option you're proposing better? Is that when we did the Bank of Montreal, the Sir John A. Macdonald building, every little tiny intervention we had to do, we had to bring three options and explain why the preferred option, why it was preferred. Everything. And I think that's, I don't know the story that you're talking about very well. Were there other options that were looked at from a technical point of view, from a hydro point of view? Because there will be those in the heritage community saying, I don't care about the hydro situation. Get it somewhere else. Don't come here in this beautiful cultural landscape. Go somewhere else. I mean, did the Quebec Cree say that when they did the James Bay project? A completely different scale, but I'm trying to draw in a very different scale of cultural landscape still, right? There's so many factors that you have to consider. And I would like to be able to tell you, yep, just use that same Standard 11. But everybody is going to apply it in different ways, and they're not going to be able to agree. The standards and guidelines, I said that in the last decade we've got all this great new mapping, and the standards and guidelines being one of the things. But it's great new mapping in the context of huge challenges, and we're still a long way from agreeing. But that's what the skills of heritage consultants need to be sharpened in order to study that, to analyze that, to find answers as perfect as we can make them. Okay. So this is what they call the closing plenary. And I can see dancing above the heads, little beers and little glasses of wine. So thank you very much.